Why the avoidant regrets pushing away the one who actually cared. You know what's ironic? The very person who runs from love often ends up missing it the most. Not because they didn't want it, but because they didn't know how to let it in. Have you ever cared for someone who kept you at arm's length? They'd let you close just long enough to make you believe they wanted you, and then suddenly they'd pull away. You were left wondering what you did wrong, when in truth, it wasn't about you at all. Avoidant people, those who fear emotional closeness, often push away the ones who genuinely care. But here's the secret they don't realize until it's too late. The love they pushed away was the very thing that could have healed them. See, avoidants crave safety. They build walls not because they want to be alone, but because closeness reminds them of old wounds, of being hurt, rejected, or unseen. So they protect themselves. But here's the twist: the walls that protect them also imprison them. At first, pushing someone away feels like control. Distance feels like freedom. But months later, when the silence settles in, that freedom feels like emptiness. And in that emptiness, they start to remember not the fights, not the fear, but the way that person cared, the softness in their voice, the way they stayed when it was hard, the way they loved without conditions. That's when regret sets in, because the truth hits them. They didn't lose someone who wanted to control them. They lost someone who wanted to love them. And regret isn't loud. It's quiet. It's the late night scroll through old photos. It's the half-written text that never gets sent. It's the realization that the person who once reached out stopped reaching. The lesson: if you're avoidant, running from love doesn't protect you. It punishes you. And if you've loved someone avoidant, understand this: their silence isn't proof you didn't matter. It's proof you mattered so much it scared them. Healing begins the moment you stop protecting your heart from the very thing it was designed to do, to love and to be loved. Avoidants don't push people away because they don't want love. They push people away because love feels dangerous. To someone who's grown up believing that closeness means pain, disappointment, or rejection, intimacy isn't comforting, it's triggering. When someone genuinely cares for them, it stirs up a part of them they've spent years trying to silence. That's why, when love starts to get real, they often start to withdraw. It's not that they suddenly stop caring. It's that the part of them built for survival takes over. The part that whispers, if you get too close, you'll get hurt again. Imagine growing up in an environment where emotional needs were ignored or punished. Maybe vulnerability was met with criticism, or affection was given and taken away unpredictably. Over time, the heart learns a dangerous lesson: closeness equals risk. So when someone new comes along and offers genuine love, it feels confusing. On one hand, they want it desperately. On the other, it feels like standing too close to a flame. It warms you, but it can also burn. So they retreat, not realizing that in protecting themselves from possible pain, they're also shutting out possible joy. Avoidant behavior often looks cold or indifferent, but beneath that surface is usually a scared heart. They might joke about not needing anyone, or they might keep the conversation light to avoid emotional depth. They convince themselves they're better off alone, but that's just another layer of armor. What they really want is connection. They just don't trust it. So they create distance through silence, distraction, or even arguments. It's not about the person in front of them. It's about their relationship with vulnerability itself. When someone truly cares for an avoidant person, it can be both beautiful and painful. Beautiful because love has the power to show them what safety feels like. Painful because that very safety can feel foreign, almost suspicious. The avoidant might test it, pulling away to see if the other person will chase, or shutting down to see if they'll still stay. These behaviors aren't about manipulation, they're about fear. Deep down, they're asking, will you still care for me when I'm not easy to love? The tragedy is that their defense mechanisms often create the very outcome they fear. The person who cares eventually feels rejected, unwanted, or emotionally drained. They stop trying, not because they stopped loving, but because they've realized love alone can't break through walls that aren't ready to come down. And when the avoidant finally feels that loss, they're faced with a painful truth. They didn't lose love because it wasn't real. They lost it because they couldn't accept it. What makes this pattern so heartbreaking is that avoidants usually aren't aware of what they're doing in the moment. They think they're protecting themselves from heartbreak, but they're actually protecting themselves from healing. Real love requires exposure. It asks you to let someone see your imperfections, your fears, and your needs. For someone avoidant, that feels like losing control, but in reality, it's the only way they'll ever experience the connection they've been craving all along. At first, distance feels like relief. To the avoidant, space means safety. When emotions start to rise and vulnerability begins to feel overwhelming, pulling away gives them a sense of control. They convince themselves that detachment is strength, that needing no one is power. It's easier to retreat into solitude than to face the discomfort of being seen, truly seen, for who they are. When they create distance, they can breathe again. Their world feels quieter, calmer, predictable. No one is asking them to open up. No one is expecting more of them than they're ready to give. It's a form of self-preservation that, on the surface, feels like peace. But what starts as peace slowly transforms into emptiness. The quiet that once felt safe becomes too quiet. The freedom that once felt liberating begins to feel isolating. In the absence of the person who cared, there's a silence that doesn't soothe, it echoes. They start to notice small things, the way they used to laugh more, the comfort of a message waiting for them, the feeling of being thought of. In trying to avoid emotional chaos, they've avoided emotional connection. And human beings, no matter how guarded, are wired for connection. Without it, something inside starts to ache. Distance, for the avoidant, is a coping mechanism, a way to regulate feelings that feel too big to handle. But what they don't realize is that emotional distance doesn't make feelings disappear, it just delays them. The loneliness creeps in slowly, disguised as independence. They fill the silence with distractions, work, hobbies, meaningless interactions, anything to avoid the growing awareness that something vital is missing. They tell themselves they're fine, that they don't need anyone, but late at night, when the distractions fade, they feel the weight of what's gone. In the beginning, the person who cared might even seem like the problem. Their closeness felt suffocating, their affection felt demanding. The avoidant interprets love as pressure because they've never experienced it as safety, so they withdraw, convinced they're doing what's best for both. But as time passes, they start to realize that it wasn't love that felt heavy, it was their fear of it. The more they reflect, the more they understand that distance doesn't bring peace, it just brings absence. The absence of warmth, of laughter, of connection, the absence of being known. What once felt like control begins to feel like regret. They thought they were protecting themselves from heartbreak, but now they're living in a quiet kind of heartbreak. The kind that doesn't explode, but lingers. They replay moments in their head, the times they could have reached out but didn't, the times they could have stayed and chosen closeness over comfort. The space they created to feel safe becomes the same space that reminds them of what they've lost. It's the cruel paradox of avoidance. The very act meant to protect the heart ends up starving it. And only then do they realize that distance may keep you safe from others, but it also keeps you safe from the one thing that makes life worth living: connection. Regret for the avoidant doesn't arrive suddenly, it creeps in quietly, like a shadow that grows longer over time. At first, they tell themselves they did the right thing. They convince themselves that stepping away was necessary, that they needed space, that love was too complicated, or that the other person was asking for too much. For a while, they even feel a sense of relief. No more pressure to open up, no more uncomfortable conversations about feelings, no more risk of being hurt. They mistake this calm for peace, not realizing it's the calm of emotional numbness. But eventually that numbness fades, and in its place comes awareness, a painful awareness of what they've lost. The avoidant begins to remember the person they pushed away, not in broad strokes, but in vivid detail. The way that person looked at them with understanding, the way they laughed at their jokes, even the bad ones, the way they offered care without asking for anything in return. These memories start to surface in moments they least expect, while driving during a quiet evening or when hearing a song that reminds them of what used to be. And in those moments, they realize something they hadn't allowed themselves to feel before, that love wasn't the enemy, fear was. At the time, they might have justified their behavior by saying things like, "I'm just not ready," or "I need to focus on myself," but deep down, they weren't protecting their peace. They were protecting their fear of vulnerability. The person who cared for them wasn't trying to control them, they were trying to connect. And that realization hits hard when it finally comes. The avoidant sees the difference between someone who wanted to possess them and someone who simply wanted to understand them. That distinction often arrives too late, after the other person has given up trying. Regret for the avoidant isn't dramatic or loud, it's subtle and haunting. It lives in the spaces between their thoughts, in the quiet reminders of a love they couldn't accept. They start to notice that no new connection feels quite the same. They might meet new people, but something's missing. That effortless safety, that emotional warmth, that feeling of being seen. What they once pushed away for being too much now feels like exactly what they crave. They realize that the person who cared didn't want perfection, just presence. And the saddest part is that they often realize this only when the door has already closed. The regret isn't just about losing someone else. It's about losing a version of themselves that could have grown through that love. They begin to understand that pushing love away didn't protect them. It limited them. It kept them stuck in a cycle of running, of mistaking avoidance for strength. And now, when they think back on the one who actually cared, they don't just miss the person, they miss the chance to become the kind of person who could have stayed. Silence can be one of the most confusing forms of communication. When someone disappears, withdraws, or stops responding, it's easy to assume that it means you didn't matter. The mind starts spinning stories. Maybe you weren't good enough, maybe you were too much, maybe they never really cared. But in the case of the avoidant, silence often hides something far more complicated. It's not that you didn't matter, it's that you mattered so deeply that being close to you became overwhelming. Their quiet isn't indifference, it's protection. And the thing they're protecting isn't themselves from you, it's themselves from their own emotions. For an avoidant person, closeness awakens vulnerability, and vulnerability feels unsafe. It brings up fears they've spent years trying to bury, fears of rejection, loss, or disappointment. When you cared for them, you mirrored back a kind of affection and acceptance they weren't sure they deserved. You made them feel seen in ways that felt both comforting and terrifying. They wanted to stay, but staying meant risking emotional exposure. And for someone whose safety depends on control and distance, that exposure feels unbearable. So they retreat into silence, convincing themselves that disappearing is easier than explaining a truth they can barely articulate. When an avoidant person pulls away, it's rarely because they've stopped caring. In fact, it's often when they start to feel real emotions that the panic sets in. They may feel an intense attachment, but attachment feels like danger. Love, to them, is something that has always come with conditions or consequences. So when it starts to feel real, their instincts tell them to run before it hurts. Silence becomes their escape router, a way to manage their anxiety, to shut down feelings that threaten their sense of control. What feels to you like rejection is, for them, self-preservation. The tragedy is that their silence doesn't just protect them, it isolates them. They end up sitting with their own confusion, replaying moments in their mind, but unable to express what's really happening. They miss you, but they don't know how to reach out without confronting the part of themselves that fears closeness. They tell themselves they're better off alone, yet they still think about you at night, still scroll past your name in their phone, still remember your voice. They just don't know how to bridge the gap between missing you and facing the fear that drove them away in the first place. For the person on the receiving end, their silence can feel like a painful dismissal, but it's rarely about your worth. You touched something deep within them, something raw, unhealed, and scared. You represented a version of love that didn't demand perfection, and that unfamiliar kindness can be unsettling for someone who's used to love being uncertain or earned. Their quiet doesn't erase the connection you had, it simply shows how powerful it was. Because sometimes the reason someone goes silent isn't that you didn't matter, it's that you mattered more than they were ready to handle. Healing for both the avoidant and the one who cared begins when vulnerability is no longer treated as a threat but as a bridge. For the avoidant, this means facing the uncomfortable truth that their walls have not been protecting them, they've been isolating them. Every time they've chosen distance over connection, they've reinforced a belief that love is unsafe, that closeness leads to pain. But healing asks them to do something radically different to stay. To sit in the discomfort of being seen. Even when every instinct tells them to run, it's not about suddenly becoming open or emotionally fluent. It's about taking small, brave steps toward trust, learning to say, I'm scared, instead of disappearing, allowing themselves to believe that not everyone who gets close will hurt them. For the person who cared, healing looks different but is just as important. They often give and give, trying to show the avoidant that love can be safe, hoping their patience will heal the other person's wounds. But love cannot replace someone's willingness to do their own inner work. Healing for them means learning to love without losing themselves, to recognize when compassion turns into self-neglect. It's realizing that holding space for someone's fear does not mean sacrificing your own emotional well-being. It's learning to understand without absorbing, to forgive without settling, and to walk away when staying becomes self-destructive. The real transformation happens when both sides begin to see vulnerability not as weakness, but as the foundation of connection. For the avoidant, vulnerability is the medicine that rewires their old beliefs. Each time they open up, they send a new message to their nervous system: closeness can be safe. Each time they communicate instead of withdrawing, they prove to themselves that love doesn't always end in abandonment. Healing doesn't happen in grand gestures, it happens in quiet moments of honesty, in small choices to stay present when escape feels easier. And for the one who cared, vulnerability means being honest about their own needs. It's saying, I want to be there for you, but I also need to feel valued and emotionally secure. It's choosing authenticity over functioning. It's allowing love to flow both ways instead of carrying all the emotional weight. By setting boundaries, they teach the avoidant what healthy love looks like. Love that gives space without disappearing, love that offers patience without enabling avoidance. When both sides embrace vulnerability, something powerful shifts. The avoidant begins to see that love doesn't have to suffocate, it can coexist with individuality and freedom. The one who cared learns that love doesn't have to mean rescuing someone, it can mean standing firm in self-respect. Together or apart, healing comes when fear no longer dictates behavior. Because when both people start to see vulnerability as strength, not risk, love transforms from something to survive into something to grow within. In the end, what this all comes down to is awareness. Awareness of how fear disguises itself as protection and how distance disguises itself as peace. The avoidant doesn't push love away because they want to be alone. They push it away because they've mistaken safety for solitude. But real safety isn't found behind walls. It's found in connection. It's found in the moments when you choose to stay open even when it feels uncomfortable, when you choose to communicate instead of withdraw, when you choose courage over control. And for those who've loved someone avoidant, your love wasn't wasted. You offered something rare: patience, understanding, and genuine care. You may not have been able to save them, but you showed them that real love exists, that not everyone leaves, that not all affection is conditional. Sometimes that lesson takes root long after you're gone. Sometimes your presence becomes the quiet turning point in someone else's healing journey. If there's one truth I want you to take from this, it's this: love is never lost when it's given with sincerity. Even when it doesn't stay, it leaves a mark. And for the avoidant who regrets, healing is always possible. The moment they stop running, the moment they realize that letting someone in isn't a weakness, but the beginning of freedom. So whether you're the one who pulled away or the one who stayed, remember that love is not about perfection. It's about growth. It's about meeting fear with compassion, learning from pain, and daring to try again. Because the heart, no matter how guarded, was never built to live behind walls. It was built to connect, to feel, and to heal. Thank you for listening, for reflecting, and for having the courage to look at love through a deeper lens. I hope you walk away today not just understanding others a little better, but understanding yourself too. Take care of your heart. It's the most honest part of you. Thank you, and take care.